Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to EDFN 554, Philosophical Foundations for Education. You're here with Professor Isaac and Dr. Roberts. We are somewhat straddling Unit 3 and Unit 4. This would be the third part, as it were, of Unit 3. But we're effectively into Unit 4 because tomorrow you would have your first, your initial post for the discussion forum, and then the following Thursday, the response. So I think there may be some concerns that, as was expressed to me earlier, but perhaps Professor Isaac is going to talk a bit about that. As of now, Dr. Hill is still on vacation and he will be back next Thursday. So we're sure that he is enjoying a much needed respite. And so with that, I want to turn over to Professor Isaac at this time.
Right. Well, we start with a word of prayer. Let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, we are thankful that we can communicate across the airways, that you can, dear Father, give us the opportunity to instruct young minds who are out in the world, educating young people, projecting Christian values as they teach, guiding them and giving them the knowledge necessary for their own personal advancements and for coping with the reality of life. We pray, dear Father, this evening you may be in our midst, and that whatever I say is going to be guided and directed by your Spirit. Be with us this evening in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Right, so let me say good afternoon to everyone, and let me just get right into the meat of the matter. Right, we are in lecture 7 today, and we are looking at the curriculum. I did indicate to Dr. Roberts a little earlier that I will sort of revise the notes that I gave for this segment, because when I looked at the structure of the notes that I provided you, it seems to be a little confusing. What I'm going to do is, however, make the presentation as it ought to be, I think, and then we're going to have the notes revised. But these notes that you have are still relevant, still necessary. In fact, it is the same notes that I'm merely reconstructing in a more coherent manner. We want to look at the curriculum. The curriculum basically that governs what is done in schools. And it is not only at the primary level in a very simple way, but certainly at the secondary level and at the university level. Generally, people see the curriculum as having a number of different, if you want to call them cognitive domains, you may, and perhaps that would be a good term to use this evening, the notion of the cognitive domain. We have the natural sciences, we have mathematics, we have the social sciences, we have the humanities, and very often the humanities and the social sciences could be, pulled together as one unit. And pervading all of this, there is values education, very important. We can't educate, we can't provide knowledge unless that knowledge is informed by a structure of values that we think worthwhile, that provide people with an understanding of truth and justice and happiness and so on. And so what we want to do this evening is to look philosophically at all of these cognitive domains, all of these subject areas. Right? We're going to first look at the natural sciences, then mathematics, and the social sciences, the humanities, and values education. Now, I gave it a certain kind of structure, which I suppose people will immediately interpret as hierarchical. There's a sense in which when we look at the subject areas, we tend to see it in hierarchical terms, in stratified terms, right? There are different kinds of knowledge, and those knowledge are grouped into sub-areas or disciplines. And natural sciences very often is perceived as the groundwork It's not like in the Middle Ages when theology and philosophy were the queen of the sciences. The queen of the sciences now are the pure sciences. And perhaps one begins with physics. And then you begin to build a structure from physics. And then there's mathematics, which works very closely with the sciences, but which in purely philosophical terms, or I would say purely ontological terms, is very, very different. The social sciences come next, and the social sciences is much more of a recent creation than the natural sciences. These disciplines were always there, but they didn't have those names, right? But the social sciences came later on, dealing with a radically different area of reality, right? The social sphere or the social cultural sphere. In some places, it's referred to as the cultural sciences. And in many instances, the individuals who research in that area, who write in that area, who theorize in that area, often attempt to make claims similar to the claims that the pure scientists make. But when we look at the nature of those disciplines, and we will do that this evening, we'll see that they're fundamentally different. The humanities is also another very significant area. In fact, I personally started my university education in the area of both humanities and the social sciences. Literature on the one hand and history on the other. Literature belongs to the humanities, and the humanities really deals with the area of what we call the arts. And again, the arts are so very different in terms of how they are developed, how they are understood, in terms of the nature of the data that is provided in all of these various disciplines, so very much in the social sciences as well as from the natural sciences. So what we're going to do this evening is to look at all of these areas philosophically. We're going to try, first of all, to establish the ontological or ontic status of these subjects and see how they are fundamentally different at the deepest philosophical levels. And it is only when we understand those differences that we are able to handle the knowledge that comes in those areas in the way in which it ought to be handled. When we talk about the natural sciences, we generally talk about three main sciences, very often referred to as the pure sciences: physics, chemistry, and biology. And it also includes the applied sciences, and many of the applied sciences are sciences that apply the knowledge based in these subject areas, right, to the field of human well-being, human reality, right? So if in applied sciences would include things like medicine. And medicine very often would be a combination of chemistry and biology primarily, mainly biology. Engineering, which would be physics and mathematics. In many instances, you also have chemical engineering and so on. And agriculture, right, clearly dealing with fauna and flora, and therefore in the area of the natural sciences. And then beyond that, you have things like cosmology. Cosmology is a very interesting scientific area, but it's not an area that allows for experimentation. And you can get evidence, but evidence from observation, not from experimentation primarily, but it's still regarded as a science. And you have the neurosciences now. I did mention the neurosciences previously when we were dealing with psychology, and said that more and more the neurosciences are coming to replace the traditional psychologies because they seem to be more evidence driven, right? They open themselves, but they allow for a greater amount of experimental work. Now, one of the things about all of these sciences is that no scientist ever questions the reality of the data that he's dealing with. He leaves that for philosophers to do, and philosophers, even up to the present time, very often they ponder and they pontificate on the reality of anything that they have to deal with in terms of knowledge. But then the natural scientist never questions whether these things, whether he's dealing with a reality out there, an objective reality before him, a reality that is available for him to observe, to experiment with, to make interventions in, to manipulate once he knows the scientific laws governing how matter behaves. So what you find, therefore, is that in the sciences, there's a sense that you're dealing with the hard core of reality in the pure sciences. Physics is the most fundamental of them, right? Then biology, and then chemistry, and then biology. Biology deals with the question of life, right? We are part of that. We are part of the whole life chain. And biology deals with that, and the unit that biologists deal with is the cell, a microscopic, right, structure, but one that we are very sure about, one that we know exists, and also one that has an amazing complexity, even when you get down to the cell of the simplest organisms, cyanobacteria, not viruses, but cyanobacteria, and a number of other single cell organisms, right, that pervade the whole of the natural realm, the whole of the biotic sphere. But when you get to chemistry, you're going beyond the cell. You're going to molecule. Cells consist of molecules, right? The central molecule being the one that everybody's acquainted with now, the DNA molecule in which the genomic script is written. And beyond the molecule, which will be a combination of atoms to form the range of substances that we have, you have physics dealing with the atom. Physics concerned with that solitary individual structure that seems to be at the basis of all of the tangible material reality in the world, the atom. And well, in the early 19th century, it was felt that that was the smallest particle you could ever discover, until people recognized that the atom itself is a massive particle as compared with the smaller particles that comprise the totality of the atom. The atom is really a fairly complex structure. It's very often imaged like how we image the solar system, with a nucleus in the middle, comprised of protons and neutrons and electrons spinning on the outer shell. And it is true, those electrons and the circumnavigation of the nucleus, that the molecules are formed because molecules can link up by the combination of electron chains and so on. Now, I know some of you are scientists and you perhaps are far better acquainted with this than I am. But that is the basis of our pure sciences, of the natural sciences. And as I said, for many natural scientists and for most people, besides perhaps a few idealistic philosophers, that is what reality is constituted of. When last week when we were talking about materialism, I didn't indicate that materialism seemed to have had a tremendous amount of support with the rise of the natural sciences. Because here people could certainly identify an objective reality out there. And they could now try to explore that reality and discover how that reality behaves, what laws govern the operation of these particles. So the sciences are extremely important. They serve almost as the foundation for all our technologies, as the foundation for most of our knowledge, right, that we have of the world out there, the objective world. And more the sciences, I mean, when we look at the history of the natural sciences in recent times, you see how many linkages are formed, how much interdisciplinarity has developed between the various sciences, the emergence of new sciences, and the combination of those with other sciences that are related in some way. So science is a very, very exciting area. The scientist has developed certain tools, and those are things that in the classroom, teachers who are teachers of natural science would need to be able to develop and cultivate in their students. One is close observation, right? A scientist is somebody who is not going to accept things because some authority told him about it. Gone are the days when scientists would say that something is the case because Aristotle said so. We're not even going to cite Einstein to validate what we're doing, because in the sciences, you have to assume that you are exploring the world right from the foundation, from the beginning, and the observations you make are observations that must not be informed by prejudices or presuppositions that come from other people's ideas and belief systems and worldviews. Right? So the sciences, observation is very important. Close observation and scrutiny. In addition to that, the methods of scientific investigation require measurement and calculation and quantification. Science is much more concerned with quantity than with quality. Certainly, quality is important. And in fact, many scientists would tell you that qualitative differences are at the bottom, quantitative differences. And so science is concerned with quantification, with measurement, right? We use our instruments of measurement in order to achieve a measure of accuracy. Very important in science is trying to achieve accuracy. In addition to this, you do not base hypothesizing or theorizing merely on conducting a single experiment, but a range of experiments. And you yourself will not only engage in conducting a range of experiments, but you will also check it out with peers who are working in the same area. Look at their findings, examine their findings, test some of their findings before the scientific community will be prepared to arrive at theorizing about the natural world. You have to determine methods of verification. How do I verify that this is so? Right? And very often there are technical procedures that are required when you have to verify a particular statement or assertion. There are certain procedures that you have to adopt, certain criteria that you have to adopt. Either scientists try to establish scientific knowledge or develop scientific knowledge, either through verification or through what one scientist calls, or what philosopher calls, falsification. If you want to determine whether something is the case, you can either try to verify it or you seek to falsify it. In fact, when Karl Popper came up with the notion of falsification, right, he seemed to have provided a better technique, a better approach to ascertaining precisely what was true and acceptable in the sciences than the method of verification. For example, if you want to know if all geese are white, all swans, that's the one that is generally given, all swans are white. He said it may be harder to look for all the swans in the world to determine that all swans are white and to make a statement like that, a dogmatic statement like that. Because there may be one that you'd leave out. It would be better to look for a non-white swan. And once you discover one non-white swan, then you're sure that all swans are not white. The method of falsifying the hypothesis or the premise is a safer scientific method very often than the method of trying to verify or validate. You have to clarify the relation between evidence and hypotheses. One of the things that the scientific mind must understand, and understands, I would think, is the difference between evidence and hypothesis. Now, you want to arrive at conclusions. You want to draw, as you look at the natural world around you, you want to draw conclusions about that world that would guide your behaviors, that would guide the way in which you navigate that world, in which you cope with the reality that confronts you. So that's extremely important, right? And you look for evidences. But the hypotheses you make are really based on those evidences. The theories that you formulate are going to come out of those, how you analyze, right? And what conclusions you draw as you analyze the evidence. But you have to recognize that there is a difference between evidence and hypothesis, evidence and theory. The theory moves a stage further, and a necessary stage, but evidence is not necessary. But theory, in fact, evidence can lead to other kinds of theorization. And in the whole scientific world, if you look at the history of science, you can see how many different conclusions scientists can come up with as they analyze evidence. They can arrive at contradictory conclusions. So one has to recognize when you move from evidence or data to theory or hypothesis. A very important difference. And all of science essentially is constituted by hypothesizing on the basis of the evidence that is available to us. One of the things that science does also is that it allows us to make predictions in the natural world. Not predictions in history, not predictions in the human world. When we come to the social sciences, we'll see that some social scientists had believed that you could do that in the social sciences. It is in the natural sciences that you can make predictions. You know that given the universality of the law of gravity, for example, anywhere you go in the universe, large objects will attract smaller objects, or more massive objects will attract less massive objects. And so that is a law of nature. So you can predict how nature would behave in terms of the gravitational law. You can predict how nature will behave 2,000 years from the event that you're talking about. Because there's a uniformity and there's a consistency about scientific law. And once you have discovered that law and you apply that law, then you can make predictions about realities in the natural world. Very important is the fact that you can manipulate the processes in the natural world and develop technologies. When you understand how nature operates and you understand those laws and you develop technologies that can utilize those laws, then you can manipulate the natural processes. And all of science is essentially manipulating. When you put fertilizers to a plant, that's an attempt to manipulate, because you understand the nutrients that the plant requires. You synthesize those nutrients, you provide the plants with it, the plant prospers, and the plant provides you with a yield at the end of the day. So very important is development of technology out of the sciences, the manipulation of the natural world, right? Most of science tends to be deterministic, and one can understand why. Determinism seems to hold in the sciences, right? It may not seem to hold in terms of human action and human decision making, but in the sciences, where everything follows and is governed by natural law, science is extremely deterministic. Things happen, and they're bound to happen in the way that they happen. Now, what really happens with the human intervention is that you can manipulate those laws to produce results that you want. But it doesn't mean that you have departed from scientific law. You're merely applying those laws and manipulating those laws to achieve a given end. Now, in your notes, I wrote down a number of terms there, and terms that I would like you to look at. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but one of the things about science is that it adopts a certain principle that is referred to as Occam's razor. Occam was a medieval philosopher, Christian philosopher, but he came up with a very lovely suggestion, and that is that, or you can say a very lovely formula, and that is that at no time, if explanations are provided for a given phenomenon in the natural world, should we accept the more complicated or more complex over the simplest. The simplest explanations are really the explanations that a true scientific spirit would recognize and accept, right? So you have inductivism, determinism, Occam's razor, and the insistence on simplicity. Up to the present time, scientists, people like Stephen Hawking and so on, looking for a theory of everything that explains the entire universe. They're looking for a mathematical formula, and their prediction is that when they get it, it's going to be a very simple mathematical formula, because all the complexity that confronts us in the natural world is a complexity that hides an underlying simplicity, right? So science has become very, very much more complex today. I'm not going to necessarily go into those areas, but what we are facing, but I think I should comment on it before I end this section, and that is that even though I've given you a beautiful picture of sciences invariance and sciences, the fact that predictability and sciences and the universality of the laws of nature, contemporary physics is plagued with a fundamental problem. And that's a problem that is at the core of physics at the present time. You're not going to get into it perhaps at the secondary school level, but you're going to get into it at the university level if you're doing the sciences. And that is the difference between Einstein's relativity theory, which offers a different explanation, right, for Newton's law of gravity and so on, and quantum physics, because quantum physics seems to be an area of physics in which law, right, in which laws do not seem to operate. It's very important to understand this whole question of law, right? In ancient times, you know, scientists saw science as a purely academic and theoretical field. Even in Aristotle's days and so on, people didn't involve themselves with very many experiments. When you had ancient scientists like or technologists like Archimedes, they were men who were involved in engineering, developing technologies to achieve certain ends, but the sciences were supposed to be pure and theoretical. You looked at the world, right, objectively, and you drew conclusions as you analyzed the data before you. It was only from the time of Galileo and Newton and so on that people recognized that science and mathematics can go together, and that science can produce results, and that we can once we understand the laws of nature. It was Isaac Newton who came up with this notion of the laws of nature, the 4 laws of motion, right, and the law of gravity and so on. And then in optics, he discovered all the laws and so on. And so the concept of the laws of nature is something that developed over time. What we're finding in contemporary science is that quantum mechanics, that's the mechanics that deals with phenomena that are smaller than the atom, the level of the particle, the electron, the micron, all of these smaller particles, the quarks and so on, that they do not seem to obey the same laws as the macro universe, the universe of atoms and cells and molecules and planets and people and so on. And so there is that fundamental problem in science at the present time. Very important to register. We're not going to be going into it in any great detail, but suffice it to say that the sciences still serve as the bedrock, right, to human knowledge. And there's hardly a scientist who would ever claim that science does not offer us a knowledge and an understanding of the real world, the world that exists, that objective world out there, a world independent of our minds. All right, let me stop here for just 2 minutes to see if there are any questions or any observations that anyone would like to make.
Is there anyone, interestingly, this this presentation this time around certainly seems less theoretical, and certainly I think I, as well as I imagine some of the other students, can much more readily identify with, because you're getting it directly into their sphere.
Yes, definitely.
And so with that, I am sure someone has some question that they would like to put forward. Our class is a little bit contracted today compared to last week.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no questions?
So let me ask a question, notwithstanding,
Yes.
and hopefully somebody might come up with one.
Right.
So you spoke initially, as you began the presentation, to talk about the fact that we may perceive the structure in terms of how you're presenting in a hierarchical fashion.
Yes.
Which might suggest some privileging of some subject matter over others.
It does. It does.
And so the question that comes to mind, I mean, what are the potential implications of necessity, not only you for the purpose of presenting, but as you say, as you suggest, that there is perhaps, unless I'm misstating you, perhaps an unnecessary structuring our knowledge according to some hierarchy.
Yes. Yes.
What are the implications of that?
Well, some of the implications are positive and some negative, right? What really happens, I think, in academia is that people who are in the sciences tend to have an air of superiority, of doing something far more significant and important than people in the arts or the humanities. And that's because there really is a kind of built-in hierarchy based on the ontological differences between the sciences. In other words, if you want to achieve real certainty, then it is in the sciences, in the pure sciences, that you can achieve that certainty. Where the further you move from the sciences, the further you move from the fundamental criteria or conditions of achieving certainty. And when we get into the arts, we'll see how very nebulous the arts can be, how very skeptical of rationality. That in the arts, you tend to privilege feeling and subjectivity over reason and objectivity. So there's a kind of built-in hierarchy. Now, the thing about it is that you can turn it the other way around. You can turn it on its head. And you can start from the arts and then move on to the sciences. Right? You can turn everything on its head. That's how Hegel Marx turned Hegel on its head. But the thing about it is that for the purposes of understanding how we move philosophically through the various cognitive areas, I think it's advantageous for us to retain that sense of hierarchy.
So I wonder about the social implications notwithstanding.
Yeah.
It would suggest that some bodies of knowledge are more important than others. It perhaps defines my salary if I was working in the US as against some another professor's salary. So these are some of the things I think about.
Well, I'm not sure what happens at USC. I hope it doesn't happen there, but I understand it happens elsewhere, like in UWI, where in the various disciplines, the salary structures are different. I was shocked when I heard that, and so that in some universities have actually hierarchized the status of the professors, right? And even though there may be differences, the one who perhaps publishes more would in the end of the day leave with more, I don't know. Yet, even within that structure, that salary structure, now one of the justifications for that very often is, well, to get a good engineer to work for you, when he can be offered so much in industry, we've got to pay him very much more. That may be the argument that is offered. Then we will pay, say, a history teacher or so. But there is built in, right, to our scheme of things, to our systems of values, right, to this whole question of, because one of the problems with the human mind is that we always attribute status to everything. We give status to employment, we give status to action, we give status to institutions, we give status to skin color and appearance. That is the problem with mankind, right? So there are really negative features about that hierarchization. And I'm glad you raised it, right? Because it's something that needs to be addressed, certainly in universities and certainly by societies. It happens in the schools too. Sometimes in the schools, the teacher who is teaching physics and so on tends to feel that he may be superior to the person who is doing blueprint drawing or something of the sort. When in truth and in fact, in my estimation, I may be wrong, but in truth and in fact, any cognitive area, or any area of cognitive, of any cognitive domain imposes the same kinds of intellectual demands on the individuals who are there. Same quality of intellectual demands. One is not really superior or inferior to the other. And that is why I sort of justified it by saying that from an ontological standpoint, the hierarchy will serve my purpose this evening. Yeah. Okay, well, let me go on to the next topic. And that is mathematics. Now, mathematics is a very curious subject. And in fact, we're talking about hierarchy and prestige. The people in academia who are given the greatest prestige are actually mathematicians, right? They are celebrated in the academic sphere, right? Now, mathematics is a very strange subject. We just dealt with the sciences, and we said that in the sciences, no practice in scientists questions the reality of the objective world out there, the world that he's observing and the world that he's examining. That is a real world, right? We are studying the nature of the molecules of a rock, but if the rock drops on our toe, we're going to suffer pain. The problem with mathematics is that mathematics avoids the real world. It seems to have very little to do with the real world at first glance. Mathematics really, and that is why, that is a sense, that is one of the reasons why, you know, not Pythagoras, Plato gave it the status that he did. Remember, when we go back to the ancient Greeks, Pythagoras was the man who said that everything consists of numbers. And when we were talking about Pythagoras, I said that that is not as foolish a notion as it may seem on the surface. That God is a geometer and a mathematician, and that the study of mathematics is actually a religious obligation. That is what Pythagoras told us. What Plato did was that he took that notion. He was Pythagorean in many respects, but in combining Heraclitus and Parmenides, one who says that being is static, and the other who says that everything is changing, the same water under the same bridge a second time, everything is changing. What Plato did was that he identified the natural world before us, not as a real world, but as a changing reality. Because for Plato, to be real is to remain the same at all times. You couldn't be, something is not real if it takes one form today and another form tomorrow, and it had a different form yesterday. That seems to void it of reality, right? So the world that we see out there, where trees grow and die, where human beings flourish and eventually succumb to disease and death and old age, a world out there where we see change constantly, that could not be the real world. The real world is the world of intelligible ideas. And that is a world in which mathematics, because when you look at the realm of mathematics, it's unchanging. 2 + 2 is always 4, whatever time of the day it is, whatever part of the world you find yourself. That seems to be real, and Plato located mathematics in that realm, right? In that intelligible realm, as representing a reality over and above the forms that we experience in the natural world. Now, Aristotle didn't accept that at all. Aristotle was quite a realist. But to a large extent, throughout the whole history of Western philosophy up to the present time, that Platonic notion of mathematics survived. That mathematics belongs to a realm out there, right? Even though it would seem that mathematics is, in fact, a lot of the ancient didn't see mathematics as something constructed by the human mind. Mathematics was discovered by the human mind, but it did not belong to the world of nature, the world of materiality and physicality. It belonged to the intelligible realm out there, but we still are the ones who have to discover it. We explore that realm. And that Platonism remained the dominant concept in mathematics until about the late 19th, early 20th century, when a number of new theories developed. Now, the thing about mathematics is that it's a strangeness about it. Einstein himself, you know, talked about it on more than one occasion when he was discussing the whole question of what mathematics really is constituted by mathematics. Even though mathematics may be out there to be discovered and not necessarily inherent in the changing reality, because mathematical relationships and formulae do not change. Yet, when we look at the natural world out there, they can be explained in mathematical terms. Mathematics lends itself readily to explaining and defining the way in which nature behaves. That is the fascinating thing about mathematics, right? In fact, Einstein said that's one of the most incomprehensible things about it, right? That the world can be defined in mathematical terms, even though mathematics, and by the 20th century, seem to be a construction of the human mind. Not really something discovered out there, but a number of new theorists, people like Gödel, right, and Euler, right, and all of these great mathematicians were coming up with new theories in mathematics. They were concocting new theories in mathematics. That is in pure mathematics. And very often it is later on, when they had constructed these systems of pure mathematics, that they discovered that it is applicable to the natural world out there, the physical world of reality. Isaac Newton himself, for example, when he was dealing with this whole question of gravity, was facing problems in defining it, right? And that's why he came up with the theory, with the system, that mathematical system of calculus, infinitesimal calculus, right? And it was calculus now that he could use to explain the behavior of gravity in the natural world. So mathematics, even though it seems to have no relationship in itself with the real world out there, because, and many people are saying now, it's a construction of mind, right? We have constructed it. Yet, it is the language of science. It is that with which science defines itself, explains its nature, right? In fact, it is only because we can manipulate these mathematical formulae or mathematical principles that we can manipulate the natural world, that we can intervene in it and create conditions that we wish to create because of the tool that we have, that tool called mathematics. And so mathematics, today people are saying that, for example, there are three major schools of mathematics, philosophical schools of mathematics, one called logicism, where people are saying that mathematics is like logic. Now, you remember when we were talking about logic and analytical statements or a priori statements, we said that they really have nothing to do with the world out there, the external world, right? When you look at an analytical statement, the explanation is inherent in the premise itself, right? All bachelors are male. You don't have to go around to examine bachelors and the anatomy of men to determine whether all bachelors are male. You just have to look at the statement, because essentially inherent in the word bachelor is the word male. So it doesn't really relate to ontology. Mathematics seems to not relate to ontology. And one of the theories is stated that mathematics is just like logic. It is really a manipulation of symbols that we create. Mathematics is a number of symbols. And then there's formalism, right? The formalists, right, are a little different. They are saying that mathematics really is a symbolic structure, it's a symbolic system. Right? It is how we with fixed rules, like a game of chess, right? And it's mathematics like a game of chess. Now, a game of chess has no relationship with reality out there. But when you get into the game and you understand the laws that govern it, then you can make the right moves and achieve the goals that you want to achieve. Mathematics is like that. And then there's intuitionism, which argues that mathematics is constructed by the human brain. It's a kind of constructivism. Now, one contemporary philosopher who is a logical positivist argues that there are two realms that knowledge generally belongs to. And as we go through the discussion this evening, you're going to see how we are moving from one realm to the next. The two realms are the realms of objectivity, that is the objective world before us out there, the tangible world, the world that we observe, the world that we analyze, the data from which we seek verification or falsification. There's that world out there. And then there's the subjective world, the world of mind, the world of my feelings, right? The world that lives within me, that I do not necessarily reveal to others, or that I only partially reveal to others, insofar as I'm prepared to express myself, to state my feelings, right? Now, what Popper is saying is that mathematics belongs to a third world. Neither belongs to the subjective world out there, the objective world out there, nor the subjective world within. For the simple reason that even though we construct mathematics as if it is a subjective category, mathematics is objective. We cannot alter the mathematical relations. We can't change 1 and 1 5. But I know there are some mathematics that can do that. But basically, the laws of mathematics are universal laws and they are objective laws. Even though mathematics does not deal with a real entity or state of affairs in the real world. I don't know if you got me there. So there's a third realm that Karl Popper puts mathematics in. Right? It does not belong to my own subjectivity, nor does it belong to that objective world out there. And so mathematics has become a very important area of knowledge. And one of the problems I think that most people have with mathematics is because it is symbolic, right? It seems to be a remove from reality. It allows us to use symbols, to manipulate symbols in order to achieve certain goals and objectives, make certain predictions, and so on, right? But mathematics itself, right, has become the handmaiden, if you wish, of the natural sciences. And in fact, the sciences are considered to be, in fact, and we talked about status just now. Status is given to the sciences insofar as it meets the criteria of mathematical accuracy and precision. And that is why physics is given a little more status than, say, biology. Because when you're dealing with the complexity of the cell, that kind of mathematical precision is virtually impossible that you can achieve if you're dealing with optics or you're dealing with, you know, your radiation and things like that, simpler structures of reality. Right? So mathematics, therefore, is considered to be, in fact, one of the criteria for scientific validation is mathematical accuracy, mathematical precision. And that is why scientists are supposed to develop real skills, in mathematics. I understand, and in some universities abroad, if you're doing a first degree in physics, met somebody like that from Eastern Europe, doing a first degree in physics, the first 2 years, all they did was mathematics. And then they went into physics, right? So it's an extremely demanding thing and an extremely exciting area also. All right, again, another point that I can stop at and invite responses and questions from the class.
Ketsia, Emily, Kazme, Nadia, Sadwana.
Yes.
Any takers?
Okay.
So I do I do want to still throw in my 2 pence here.
Sure.
You know, so as you're talking, and it sort of goes back again because we sort of can't get away from the idea of this hierarchy of knowledge. And so, you know, I worry, as it were, or I don't know whether perhaps it's founded into some degree or not, about the compartmentalization of knowledge.
Right.
That it's interesting. There's much that is said about the scientist who works well in the lab, but really cannot translate what they do in the lab into something that the general public can understand as such.
Okay.
You know, in other words, they don't necessarily develop those other skills that people use daily to communicate, and that makes life meaningful in that sense. So that's one of the things that I do wonder about.
Yeah.
And one of the other thing that I think about is that relationship between mathematics and music. I don't know much about it because I'm not a musician.
Yeah.
But I do hear a bit said about that connection between individuals who are musically minded should have some sort of a mathematical sophistication in terms of their abilities. Can you speak to that?
When I come to music, but Dr. Roberts, I really am happy for your interventions, right? Because what they're doing is that they're problematizing what I'm saying, right? They're definitely problematizing what I'm saying. Right? I'm giving you the thing as it's normally easy to teach. But when we get into the real world, we have to have a certain kind of adeptness that requires a knowledge of all of these areas coming together. I remember I used to tell my students at secondary school, you know, they didn't want to do music at all. They said they wanted to do computers and they want to study technology and so on. And I would always tell them, I said, suppose you asked to repair an electronic organ. How are you going to handle it? You know, in the real world, all of these things come right back together again. What we do is that we compartmentalize in the area of academia, right, for ready assimilation of the data. We need to categorize, right? We need to stratify and things like that. But in the real world, everything has to pull together again, right? When you're making a car, for example, it is strict technology and engineering, and the mathematics must be right. And so I remember once, you're not putting a wrong part of the car, what it was, the one that contains the water. It looked like the original, but its measurements were different. The car wouldn't work. But on the other hand, when you're finishing that car, it is the aesthetic qualities of the car that determine whether I would buy it or not. It has to look nice. It has to sit nice on the road. You know, so in reality, they all have to come back together again, right? But it is for academic purposes that we categorize and compartmentalize, right? But we cannot retain that kind of thing, right? Because, and the point you're making about the scientists, it holds also for the non-scientists, for the social scientists and and people in humanities. If you're not a good communicator, then whatever you're doing in your particular area, right, it could well seem to have no relationship or not touch the real world of people out there. And there's a number of scientists and mathematicians are poor communicators, I know, right? They seem to be lost in a world of their own and so on. But they're excellent communicators also, and in those areas. So that really seems to have to do much more with personality and communication skills than with the inherent nature of the material that you're dealing with.
So just before you go on, and I give Emily has her hands up, so I want to give her an opportunity in a while.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of C.P. Snow's issues concerning the scientific community,
yes,
and the non-scientific community in particular.
Right.
So let me give the opportunity to for Emily.
Yeah, pleasant good day, everyone.
Hello.
Yes, good day, everyone.
Yes, we're hearing you.
All right.
Yes.
Well, I am Emil, not Emily. I'm a male, not a female. First of all,
yeah. My apologies, Emil.
Yeah, it's no, it's cool. I understand the concept where Sir talk about mathematics, and I believe yes, mathematics are in everything, and it helped the world evolve to what it is today. Because of maths, we can even talk on this medium here. You understand? Because everything calculate and could create electricity and everything. Maths have a part to play in everything.
Yeah.
But what I really want to ask is, so when you talk about like what is the intangible realm? I don't understand the intangible realm.
All right.
When you use the word realm, like I know it's a different space and time, but how you explain it? Like I can't even explain it.
All right. You will really have to go back to the first lecture, right, which I gave in the course, because it is there that you are dealing with Plato and his postulation of that intangible realm, that intelligible realm of ideas over against the world of things. And it has to do with the story of the cave. Remember I told you about the allegory of the cave, when Plato came up with this notion that many of us are seeing the world before us, but we're really seeing shadows. That intelligible realm, that there's another realm where truth exists and where reality exists, but it is a reality that is characterized by permanence, not by change. If this world, that this material world is a world of change, it cannot be a real world. It is an immaterial world. It is a changing world, right? The world of reality is the world of ideas, the world of forms, right? No, that is a Platonic notion, and I refer to it again because that Platonic notion continues to define the philosophy of mathematics down to the 20th century. You think you're following me there?
Yeah, I think I'm following you there. High science.
Okay, yes. Well, merely philosophy. That is merely philosophy more than science. Right? But remember that you have available the lectures from the earlier lectures in the series, and it's something that you must go back to from time to time. Because sometimes, you see, for example, now that we're discussing this, when I discussed that in the earlier phase, it would now make more sense to you. Right?
Right.
The thing about knowledge and so on is that you always have to be connecting the threads. What you did discuss before with what you're discussing after and so on, in order to get a coherent picture of the whole.
Okay.
Emil, thank you very much for your input.
Thanks, sir.
All right, so I want to go on to the social sciences now. The social sciences, again, that is an area that, in a way, is a kind of 18th, 19th century invention. It isn't that the data wasn't out there, that people weren't dealing with issues that we can put in the social sciences. For example, history was written since ancient times, right? But it wasn't called a social science. It wasn't called a science at all, right? The social sciences really incorporate a range of knowledges, right, that cannot be defined in physicalist terms, in material terms. The world of history, for example, when you're dealing with history, history makes the same kinds of claims as the sciences, but in an entirely different way, right? I say that the French Revolution took place in the 15th century, and you tell me you disagree with that. I have to validate that. Now, how can I validate it? If you're in the natural world, the world of physics or chemistry, I just get two organisms and bring them to illustrate my point. But history is in the sphere of time. The past is gone. I have to use other methods for authentication and for validation and for proof. Right? History, sociology, which is a new science. History existed from ancient times. We have history in the Bible, right? The Samuel, the book, well, it even starts before Samuel in the Torah. A lot of the Torah is history, Exodus, Judges, and so on, and then come to a more authenticating, self-authenticating kind of history when you get this to Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. And then there's a great father, so-called father of Western history, Herodotus, right, who wrote at around the 5th century BC, right, about the time when many of these other people like Ezra and so on were writing. You have a lot of history written in the ancient times, but it wasn't called a science. It wasn't called a social science. It now is regarded as a social science, right? And then you have sociology, which is a new science. The people who are into the social sciences, social studies, and so on would know that social studies is really a 19th century thing. Emil Durkheim and people like them, right? These are the people who developed that new system of knowledge, body of knowledge. And it differs from history in that whereas history, right, looks at reality as a lived reality, because history is dealing with a lived reality. You can talk about the history of biology and the history of the world and the history of the planet and so on, but history really deals with a lived reality, a human reality, right? Sociology tends not to look at that human reality from the dimension of time as it moves from past to present to future, but it looks at systems and structures. In fact, structuralism lends itself readily, right, to the whole sphere of sociology. So you see things in terms of structures. When you look at a society, you see nations and nation states, and you see classes in a society, and you see institutions and traditions and cultural practices and things like that, and the arts of a society. all of the structures, right, that come together to define people's existence within that domain. And then there's the question of geography. Geography is a little more problematic because even at the secondary level, you generally have, you know, at least at my time in school, I don't know if they have changed it, you would have physical geography and economic geography. Well, physical geography was sort of an extension of the sciences. Economic geography, however, an extension of economics. And then you have subjects like anthropology, the study of man, nature of man, the study of law, right? And how law develops, how it is applied, what is its significance in a society. All of these are the kinds of subjects that you deal with in the social sciences. I didn't mention psychology, but psychology is also one of those areas in the social sciences. Now, what do they do? What do the social sciences do? They are not looking at an objective physical world out there. They really do not have very much interest in that world. They are dealing with a world created by man, a world that we have constructed collectively. No individual is responsible for the construction and shaping of that world, but it is a world that we have developed collectively. It is a world that exists in something that and many people have theorized that exists almost in a collective consciousness of man. It is as if all of us human beings have created a single consciousness that produces that world. The world of history, the world of society, the world of culture, the world of economic relationships, and so on. And so they survey phenomena outside of the realm of the physical. It is a world of human action. It is a world of human intention. Social phenomena must not be viewed as natural phenomena. They are not physical. They are intentional. They are dependent on meaningful actions, right? It is people acting meaningfully among themselves within the domain of human relationships, either in the economic sphere, or the cultural sphere, or the social sphere, or the religious sphere, or the educational sphere, and so on, right? In all of these spheres, political sphere, it is people acting together meaningfully, trying to achieve personal goals, as well as common social goals that creates that realm of knowledge, that provides us with data in the social sciences. So it's radically different. Now, social scientists, right, are dealing with things like cultural change, right? How is it that people wore, you know, a certain kind of clothing 200 years ago and they've changed to another kind of clothing, or the kind of foods that they eat, or the kinds of activities that they engage in, the games that they play. Social scientists want to look at underlying trends within a society. The laws, they try to discover whether there are laws governing that society. That has become very problematic. There are a number of social scientists who are saying that there are no laws governing any society, right? But there are those who look for those underlying laws, right? And Marxists, for example, claim that there are these laws underlying society, and that you can predict the outcomes of social evolution and social change if you study those trends that we see before us, and of which we are a part, right? So that one of the tasks of the social scientists is to look for those underlying laws, those trends, to identify causation. What causes this? Trinidad is now faced with that problem that we seem to have no solution to. What is underlying? What are the underlying reasons for crime, the high level of crime in Trinidad? Politicians and governments come up with easy solutions. Just get a good commissioner of police and so on, and we'll solve all our crime problems. Ridiculous. What we have to study is the totality of the society and see what are the factors for disease within that society, even as we are studying a single human organism or a single animal organism. What causes something to emerge, a pathological outcome like crime, a high manifestation of crime in the society? What causes that? We have to look at underlying trends, the causal relationships in a society, right? The things that govern our behaviors, the kinds of things we're interested in. Social scientists look for collective regularities in the way in which the society evolves and develops and so on. And those regularities will tell us a lot about, you know, what interests human beings, what are our preoccupations, what are our goals generally, collectively, right? So that the sphere of the social sciences is a sphere that deals with a range of phenomena radically different than the natural sciences. It was about the 17th century that people like Vico, Giambasita Vico, and later on Dilthey demarcated that subject matter. And what they pointed out was that whereas the natural sciences are concerned with finding universal law, massive regularities in the natural world, when you get to the social sciences, they are very different. Right? They have to take into account the particular, and even those social sciences may be looking for universality, they have to take into account individualistic differences between the beings that occupy a certain social space. Right? So the criteria, right, that you have to use in order to analyze social phenomena are fundamentally different than the criteria that you use to analyze natural phenomena. Now, earlier o'clock, there was that dispute, and Dr. Roberts has been referring continuously to that dispute between one segment of academia and another segment. And very early, when the social scientists emerged, social scientists attempted to make similar claims to the validity of their hypotheses or suppositions or analyses or conclusions, right, by using quantitative methods. And that is where statistics comes in, right? I remember when I was doing graduate work in education, I had to study statistics. And I dropped mathematics since from 5. Statistics became necessary, and I'm sure that you all are doing it now, again, right? Because even though you are dealing with these fragile, right, and intangible, as it were, realities in the social sphere, you want to be able to make assertions that are intelligible to others and that can be utilized by others. You want to be able to say, for example, something like crime in a society may have to do with the fact that there's not an equitable distribution of the resources of the society, of the wealth in the society, and there's too much poverty facing too great wealth and affluence. You want to be able to say those kinds of things. You want to look for regularities, right, so that you can play an important role in creating the kind of society that everybody wants to live in. And so quantitative methods are used in the social sciences. But the natural scientists would always say, but you can't be certain that those quantitative methods are really valid, because you cannot achieve mathematical precision and mathematical accuracy. But you can only perhaps gauge certain kinds of statistical regularities. But in terms of mathematical precision, which is what we do in the sciences, you can't achieve that. And there's a sense in which perhaps the early social scientists felt a little inferior to the natural scientists. I don't think that is any longer so. I think that very often we recognize the validity of the spheres that we are in, and the fact that they make different demands on us. That what may be effective in one area may not necessarily be effective in another area. And that what we use, we have to find, however, legitimate criteria in order to develop our sciences and so on. And therefore, the social sciences have been struggling to do that over the decades, right? They have to determine the correct methodological procedures. And so, for example, the social sciences use things like survey sheets, right? And all kinds of questionnaires. That never happens in any of the scientists. Well, it happens in some of the scientists like medicine and so on. But generally, because they tend to be bordering on the social scientists in certain areas. But basically, a physicist and so on, you don't deal with questionnaires, right? You deal with microscopes, right? But the social scientists will have to adopt other kinds of mechanisms in order to collect data and in order to analyze that data so that he could come up with reasonable conclusions, and conclusions that can pass the test of academic validity. Right. Now, the social sciences, right, are sciences that, well, in the 19th century, a number of thinkers were discussing ways in which we need to interpret things. Very often have to do with biblical interpretation and so on. and exegetical methods of interpreting the Bible and things like that, and theologies and so on. And a number of the science of hermeneutics developed. Hermeneutics is the art of interpretation. And a number of hermeneutic philosophers or thinkers came up with the notion that what is characteristic of the social sciences is a method called Verstehen. Very often, the Verstehen, it literally, I think, means understanding in German. It's a German term, but very often the Germanic word is retained. V-R-S-T-H-E-N, Verstehen. And that method, he says, relies on an intuitive kind of interpretation of human action. One that avoids both the analytical and the syntactic categories of scientific knowledge. Remember, we used those terms before, right? The sciences are concerned with analysis and synthesis. Synthesis has to do with that which is based on experience, empiricism. Analytic is that which has to do with rationality. When you are in the social sciences, you have to go beyond analysis and synthesis, right? Beyond empiricism as well as beyond rationalism. And there must be a kind of intuitive grasp of the essence of the social phenomena that you are studying. It's an interesting point to bear in mind, right? But it's one that is fraught with a number of dilemmas, a number of problems. There's a serious problematics that has to do with it. And a famous hermeneutic philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer, pointed out some of them. He says that when you're interpreting social phenomena, one of the things you cannot avoid, right, is the evidence of prejudice or subjectivity in what you're doing. And remember when you're talking about colonialism and post-colonialism, we were able to deal with that issue to some extent. Right? I talked about the Columbus discovering the West Indies. Right? And I said that statement is not true. It's not about being true or being false. Because what we have to look at is the perspective from which it's made. In other words, what Gadamer calls the prejudice or the subjectivity that is brought to bear on it. And he says that is inescapable in interpretation. When you are interpreting social phenomenon, there's an element of your subjectivity that is imprinted on that interpretive instrument. You can't avoid it. And besides that subjectivity, there's another problem. And in fact, it is not just a problem, it is an advantage in some respects. But that is what he calls the fusion of horizons. In other words, if I'm studying the French Revolution, now one of the things that historicists were doing in the early days of historical method, the development of historical method, is that they were trying to capture the history from the point of view of the people who lived that history. You're talking about the French Revolution, but you're trying to capture it as a Frenchman who possibly was facing the guillotine in France in the 1890s. But Gadamer is saying, no, you don't have to do that. You cannot do that. You are seeing the French Revolution. You are seeing the history of ancient times. You may be reading about the wars of David, right, in Palestine. But you cannot avoid seeing it from a 21st century standpoint. You're locked in your own horizon. And what you have to try to do is to bring the two horizons together in a harmonious manner, in a dialectical manner. In fact, you should be the instrument that allows those two periods to converse with each other so that you see the past in terms of your present reality. And you explain that history, right, in terms of your own understanding and experience of history seen from a contemporary standpoint. And a good illustration is the story of Christ. Right? When Christ was alive, almost nobody knew about him. Right? That was a time when this great historian Josephus was writing. He was a contemporary of Christ. Plato, Plotinus, and these, not Plotinus, that Jewish philosopher in Alexandria. He was Philo of Alexandria. He was a contemporary of Christ. And in their writings, nobody made mention of Christ. Christ died and they didn't make mention of him. They didn't make mention of anything that he did. Today, the greatest historical figure of all time in all ages is the figure of Christ. Because we can reinterpret that from a 21st century standpoint. We see the tremendous impact that his life and ministry in Palestine 2,000 years ago has had on the whole historical process. First, the Western historical process, Mediterranean, then Western, and now the global historical process. So to understand Christ, we don't have to necessarily go back imaginatively into the first century and try to capture, right, a sense of the moment or the zeitgeist. We have to evaluate him from our own contemporary standpoint. We have to see him, right, as a modern man sees him, so that we can really and fully understand his historical significance. And that is one of the qualities of the historical interpretation, or one of the qualities of the social scientific or social theoretic interpretation, right? And in addition to that, you have other kinds of approaches to interpretation. If a materialist, for example, if he's looking at the social sciences with very materialistic interpretations, he will explain social phenomena in terms of climatic conditions, in terms of geography, in terms of topography, right? Why are Jamaicans such good runners? Because there's a massive Blue Mountain Range running in the center of Jamaica, and everybody is impacted by it. So you have to either run up the hill or run down the hill. Geography explains running ability and performance in the Olympics, right? So you have the materialistic interpretations, all of which are relevant, but none of which must be accepted as the totality of the explanation, right? Then there's the whole question of methodological individualism, which explains phenomena by looking at meanings, the meanings that they have for individuals. In addition to this, a lot of social theorists are generally adopt a kind of philosophy of system building and system organization, right? They see system in things, they see things holistically, and therefore to explain one dimension, one area, right, of a social complex or syndrome, you have to look at the totality in order to explain that one instance. Right? It's not possible to just explain individualized phenomena within the category of social phenomena all by itself. You have to explain it in terms of the totality. And that is considered to be an extremely important area of the social sciences. All right, again, I will stop here. We have half an hour to go again, and I have 2 more areas to deal with. But any responses so far? No responses.
No one. So, you know, while you're going there, and I'll try to be as quick as possible so that you can get the majority of the half an hour that is left.
Right.
I couldn't help but think about, on the one hand, when you were talking about, let me probably just address the question and that you see where I'm coming from. So
yes.
On the one hand, there's the effort to make a distinction between that which is qualitative as against that which is quantitative.
Yes.
And then I think about behavioral economics.
Okay.
And behavioral economics seem to define human behavior in these very predictable terms.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to look at the philosophy that underlies some of these things that actually drive policy. Mm-hmm. So that even today, you know, a lot of economic theory is based on this idea of behavioral economics, and so that you can somehow or the other predict human behavior in terms of these regular patterns, and therefore you can make decisions economically in terms of, as it were, spreading the wealth. And so yet we end up with a situation where, if to just speak in the American context, where you have the 1% with the vast majority of the wealth, and then
Yeah.
you have the masses that have no money, or very little, I should say. So, you know, that's one of the things that I thought about while you were talking to that particular issue.
Again, such a very beautiful intervention. The thing about economics is that one of the things that economics attempted to do in a way was to separate itself from the social sciences and claim to be and claim to have the capacity to achieve mathematical precision as much as the natural sciences. Because I mean, so the economics is infiltrated by mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
I remember people saying that some of our economists down here, people like Lloyd Best and so on, the problem they had when they went to Cambridge was that they didn't have a mathematics base.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're doing economics in Cambridge and these foreign universities, you have to be very strong in mathematics.
Yes.
So mathematics was economics was making an attempt to become heavily mathematical to the point where they claim to be different than the other social sciences. What is interesting is that you are showing that there's a return to origins, because behavioral economics recognizes, right, that you have to understand human behavior and human psychology if you're going to understand how people buy and sell and why they want to make profit and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really where economics started. Economics was started by moral philosophers. Right? People like Adam Smith and so on, they made a tremendous contribution to moral philosophy, early British moral philosophy. And they were trying to explain that whole profit-making motive and so on from a psychological standpoint. And Adam Smith created, right, in a sense, the science of economics, which moved in the direction of mathematization, right, to achieve the status of the natural sciences, but which recognizes that it still is a social science and has to root itself, ground itself in an understanding of human behavior.
Which is interesting, that while at the same time, more modern, in my mind anyway, more modern economics tries to look at it in these sort of minute and current current manifestations of human behavior. I think about what you referred to as the historical perspective that sometimes is missing from that whole question of behavioral economics.
Yeah.
And so we make laws or we make policy, economic policy, not figuring in those historical
definitely
elements.
Yeah. And in a sense, you know, a lot of the sciences, they are coming full circle. Economics clearly is one of them, right? Trying to abandon roots which they felt was in a very shaky, ontologically shaky realm, ethics and so on, and now finding that they have to return to an understanding of how human beings behave, how they think, how they make choices and so on.
So I just have two more quick things for you. On a policy, on the side of policy again, I think about the rate of the progression of technological change. When you referred just now to this whole issue of crime, but yet at the same time, so society seems to be really progressing technologically. Unfortunately, we end up with the problem of technology because technology itself becomes a problem, particularly in the way it is now used by certain individuals. And now, you have a problem in terms of the ability of a government to address increasing social problems. And I say that in the context of how sometimes funding may be given for a particular area of study and funding not given to another area of study that actually needs the funding, and so that you could end up with a balance, as it were.
That is so very true, right? I mean, when the Americans realized in the 60s and 70s that they were behind the Russians in the space race, a tremendous amount of funding for the sciences, to the neglect of many of the other areas, because they felt they had to catch up. So that political policy, right, very often has a lot to do, governmental vision for a country and so on, have a lot to do with how research is funded.
So I think about Guyana, in terms of the document, I remember sending to you, and I don't know much about it, but just on the basis of that document,
Yeah.
where there's a push to really establish the teaching of computer skills within the school,
Yeah.
and I wonder, what that could mean, not only for the present but also for the future. It's just a comment.
And it's a valuable comment. I would add to that, I mean, just recently, before he died, Stephen Hawking, the great British physicist, says that machines will take over. Right? That humanity is actually threatened by the technology he has made.
Yes.
And it comes from two areas.
Others.
It comes from two areas of technology. It comes from artificial intelligence and robotics.
Yes.
Right? And we are now we are actually making machines that don't need us any longer to make more machines. They can make their own machines.
That's true.
So that could be an area of danger. Theoretically, that is.
Yes.
That could be an area of danger, right? So that the technology, we have to make sure that we do not allow the technology to become almost godlike, right? Where we allow it to control our lives, to define our goals and objectives, right? That is what is happening to a number of young people. There are so many young guys now who are not playing football and cricket again because they can do it on their tablets. Now, when you reach that stage, then your very humanity is threatened, right? So one has to be guarded about that, and one has to, even in the use of tech, because we can't avoid it. That's what we're using now at this particular point in time in order to reach students, thousands of miles away. But the point is that we have to know how to use technology to enhance, to make for human flourishing, to use an Aristotelian term. Technology that contributes to human flourishing and doesn't diminish that flourishing.
I just want to address one last thing, and this has to do with, you talked a while back about, hermeneutics and how people seem to, that you look at the issue of Jesus's life and his teachings in terms of your current context. To understand and appreciate, its underlying meaning as such. Whereas others would argue as such that to do so would basically dismiss the context in which Jesus actually grew, what he said meant for those of his time.
Right. Very correct. And it's a very subtle kind of academic posture one has to take, because you don't want to see people living 2,000 years ago as if they are 20th century folk.
Mm-hmm.
You want to capture them in their context and understand the historical differences. But when you are measuring historical significance, you have to do it as a 20th century person, right? This is what was achieved, and this is its impact. And so that fusion of horizons is a very, very important strategy that needs to be adopted as you handle sociological and historical phenomena.
Thank you very much.
Right, I'm going on to the humanities now. The humanities. Humanities is a broad area, right? And in a sense, the humanities is much more concerned with the aesthetic sensibility, right? The scientific correctness. Immanuel Kant had established 3 spheres of values. One sphere he called the cognitive, the other one the ethical, and the next the aesthetic. The aesthetic is what governs most of these subject areas in the humanities. So the humanities deals with literature. And literature has a range of subdivisions or subsets: poetry and drama, and the novel, which started in the 18th, 19th century, and so on. And you have other kinds of literatures, right? But these are the dominant ones that we're acquainted with when you're studying literature. Your Shakespeare and things like that, right? And then there's music. Music relates to dance and so on. And there's both vocal music and instrumental music. Music is also a very broad area. And then there's art, right? Art would include painting, drawing, and so on. It would include sculpture, architecture, although architecture is one of those interesting disciplines which straddles between engineering on the one hand and art on the other. Right, a number of those beautiful skyscrapers that we see in the American skyscrapers, for example, right, which followed the continental style in the early 20th century. You're not seeing very much art in that. You're seeing pure geometry, right, and geometrical measurements and so on, right angles and so on. But when you look at Chinese skyscrapers now, and some of the beautiful skyscrapers that are going up in places like the Middle East and so on, then you see how much art impacts on contemporary agriculture, especially postmodern agriculture, right? So these are areas of the arts that one has to deal with. And what links these various areas, literature and music and art and so on, is the fact that they belong to a domain that one philosopher refers to as the domain of human expression creation. Expression creation, a very interesting term, right? Because it talks about me expressing my own inner feelings and my own subjectivity. I'm expressing what I am in what I produce. And also it is creation. I am creating, I'm constructing, I'm putting something together. Right? So the song that I sing is an example of that expression creation. I express feelings in that song. I create that song with lyrics, with words. And that really has nothing to do with understanding the nature of physical reality. The question about physical reality is totally irrelevant to that. When I'm reading a work of literature, you're reading a play by Shakespeare, and you're trying to analyze why Hamlet took so long to kill his father-in-law. That's one of the big problems in Hamlet. He starts by wanting to kill his father-in-law and can't do it up to the end, right? Why that happens. And you try to analyze why it happens and you investigate the speech and so on. But you're not even sure if there was ever such a person as Hamlet. And that is irrelevant. Whether Hamlet lived or didn't live is irrelevant to you, because Hamlet came out of the imagination of Shakespeare, who gave a certain kind of authenticity to his portrayal, a certain kind of realism to his portrayal. And the task of the literary critic is to analyze that as a work of the imagination. It has nothing to do with necessarily with the world of reality out there. It may touch on the social sciences, but it certainly has nothing to do with the natural sciences. So what the artist is doing is that he is privileging aesthetic values over cognitive values. He's much more concerned with feeling over rationality. He's much more concerned with his subjective moods and so on, and articulating them as authentically as he can. Then he's concerned with representation. A lot of modern art has moved away from representationalism. Art before was very representational until the camera came into being. And then we got all kinds of various painting styles. Picasso being one of the most famous to develop some of these non-realistic or anti-realistic styles. But it is a case in which you're expressing feeling, and you're not really, and you're separating that, right, from any task or function of representationalism. And that is what the area of the arts seems to be. Now, remember when we were dealing with the ancient Greeks with Plato, and everything starts with Plato. Plato had a serious problem with poetry. And in his Ideal Republic, he said he thinks he's going to banish poets from his Ideal Republic. Because poets lie. They make up stories on the gods. They tell untruths. Sometimes they even repeat depraved stories on the gods. And if you want to create an ideal republic, you have to get rid of those elements. Now, when Plato said that, nobody took him on, right? People, I mean, the Greek plays were the greatest things that could have happened in any part of Athens or any one of the great cities. Everybody wanted to go to see them. But it had a tremendous impact on Christianity in the Middle Ages. And in fact, Augustine himself, if you remember, adopted that Platonic notion, and for a very long time, the church was suspicious of the arts. They recognized that the arts didn't deal with reality, deal with fiction. Novels are about fiction, rather than fictional lies, and lies are ethical disvalues, and therefore we should avoid it. So it had a tremendous impact for a very long time. I think we have moved away from that. Within my lifetime, I have seen the arts moved into Adventism, because as a very puritanical religion, we tended to be very wary of the arts. Literature was not taught in our schools, right? But literature eventually came in, and we have recognized the significance of the arts. Aristotle argued that Plato is not wholly correct. Aristotle argued, for example, as opposed to Plato, that precisely because the arts are involved in imitation, Plato argued that imitation was thrice removed from reality, because the world of objects imitates the intelligible world of ideas, and art imitates the world of objects. So it's twice removed from reality, right? Aristotle argued that no, imitation is important. That is what art is about, mimesis. That's the word he used, mimesis. It is about imitation. And when we imitate the real world, we learn a lot. In fact, Aristotle came up with that notion of catharsis, and that has remained for a long time, a notion that has justified the arts, especially drama. He says, what happens when we witness a tragedy or a comedy, but more especially a tragedy, is that we experience a purgation of our emotions, which he calls catharsis, and that this is desirable for human well-being. It was taken up, right, by a number of medieval philosophers also, who would always advocate the importance of the arts. But largely in today's world, right, that notion of catharsis remains a very significant one. And that is why in psychoanalysis, you find people using psychodrama as a therapeutic means of helping people to discover their emotions and understand it and overcome it, if not repress, but overcome it, right? So that the notion of catharsis came out of that Aristotelian attempt to justify the arts. One writer referred to the arts as beautiful and useful, so that the arts achieve both aesthetic objectives as well as ethical objectives. So you can use the arts to teach moral values. You can communicate, right, positive moral values through the arts. So the arts are not just beyond good and evil. They are not just in the domain of the beautiful and the sublime. The arts are also in the domain of the useful, the pragmatic, the morally uplifting. And then when we were dealing with Hegel, remember we talked about Hegel's notion of the spirit of the age. It is through the arts that we can measure, right, the spirit of the age. We can see when you listen to, for example, say a Trinidad Calypso, you can get a very good insight into the mind of the Trinidadian, right? You understand his mind, how it's working. You look at the themes that he's preoccupied with, and you see the areas of our existential being that preoccupies us, right? So that the arts are very often a mirror that societies need if they have to understand the spirit of their age, or what he called the zeitgeist. And so art, right, is something that it's a legitimate area of human activity, legitimate area of human concern. We cannot live without it, right? And when you are evaluating a work of art, then you look for things like the coherence of the work of art. Do all the parts fit together? You look for the symmetry, how things are balanced in the structure. You try to determine the authenticity of the writer, if he's really expressing his feelings, or if he's dishonest in the communication of feelings. You look at the autobiographical elements of the work. To what extent do his own experiences figure, or are they represented in the final product of the work of art? Right? You see how he treats the major existential issues like death and grief and boredom and so on. All of these existentialist issues. How does the artist deal with them in the painting, in the poem, in the play? We look for creativity of vision and style. Right? Art is much more concerned with style. And you can be saying something that amongst a very little sense, but it can be said beautifully. Right? A lot of instrumental music, for example, orchestral music, you can't say what it's all about. difficult to say what it's all about. It communicates feelings and moods, but its communication is not linguistic. It can't be interpreted in words. And so art plays a very, very important role. Now, I have a number of notes there, and I think some of you may be acquainted with some of these. It's interesting to see how art developed in the late 20th century, right? And in early 21st century, contemporary avant-garde art, the modernist assault on traditional sensibility, the modern novel. Modern novel is a strange thing, right? Very often the modern novel sometimes could start from the end and end up at the beginning. Time is dislocated and so on. Then you have people like Picasso and Dali in paintings, Stravinsky in music, new modes of music, new tonalities, right, that they brought to bear, Anthony Artaud, and so on in the area of drama. And a very interesting concept in contemporary literary interpretation or criticism is the concept of the death of the author. And what they mean by that is that very often in interpreting a piece of work, it is less important to know what the author intended, what he meant, and more important to determine how that work has impacted on us, how we respond as readers or as onlookers to the work of art. And since we just have over 10 minutes more, 15 to 10 minutes, I will go to the last part, and that has to do with the whole question of values education or values transmission. Whatever we are teaching, whether we are in the area of the arts or in the area of the sciences, we have to recognize that the skill of teaching, the task of teaching, right? The vocation of teaching is underpinned by a commitment to positive moral values. And as Christian teachers, they need to be Christian moral values. Now, ethics is a very interesting area, and we looked at ethics when we were dealing with Immanuel Kant, for example. Remember that Kant was the man who said that ethics emerges out of the demands of practical reason, and he talked about the categorical imperative. He says that it's deontological ethics, as ethics is referred to as deontology or deontological ethics. It's not ontological. It comes from the practical reason and not from pure reason, right? It establishes the categorical imperative as the standard of moral values. We must be able to universalize a moral behavior. He also taught us that man is an end in himself, not a means to an end, right? And that we must treat other human beings as ends in themselves and not means to an end. Kantian ethics is in a number of various schools of ethics that characterizes the contemporary scene, and it's important that we recognize them. A lot of contemporary ethics is not Kantian, but utilitarian. Utilitarianism seems to dominate, right, very much of the ethical sphere or ethical discourse in the 21st century, late 20th, 21st century. This utilitarianism is the work of men like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and so on. And it's closely tied up with this whole notion of democracy and human equality and so on. The argument that utilitarians advanced was that what determines the goodness of something is not any values that come from a transcendent realm, but it must signify, or it must accrue to the greatest good of the greatest number. The greatest number of people can enjoy, right, whatever is presented or offered as a good, and very few people may be adversely affected. That determines its goodness. That is what utilitarianism is all about. That determines its goodness, its rightness, its justice. And our whole political system is based on utilitarian ethics. Right? If two parties are fighting an election and one gets 51% of the vote and the next 49, then you think that the one with 51% they will have the total right to run the society. Ignore the 49% who are now a minority. It is majoritarian democracy that underpins utilitarianism. Now, the utilitarian argument is quite a significant argument, and it allows for a measurement. In fact, at one time, the early utilitarians talked about the calculus, right, of goodness, that you can actually make a mathematical evaluation as to whether something is morally acceptable or not. You can calculate how many would benefit from it and how many would not benefit from it. But utilitarianism is insufficient in many respects, because very often dominant moral positions are held, right, on seriously flawed ethical grounds. That's why we have to change. That's why we have to make new laws. That's why we have to, you know, or alter the laws in a society to increase human rights and so on. So that utilitarian ethics cannot provide us with all the answers to our ethical problems. A lot of contemporary ethics is subjectivistic and relativistic. Right? But when you talk about relativism, we are saying that values are relative. Relatives is something else. And many people will say they are relative to the circumstances in which one finds himself. You can't impose absolute moral values on any group of human beings, because values are relative to time and place and situation. In fact, there's a whole Christian ethical philosophy called situational ethics, which is very, very relativistic. Right? But situational ethics argues that there's one dominant, major absolute ethical principle, and that's the principle of love. And all other principles are relative to that. But relativists argue that all moral principles are relative. They are relative to the time, the society in which you live, right? If you understand the society and what the needs and demands of that society are, that may have been right at that time, but it could be very wrong at this time. There are no absolute standards. And then there's Christian morality, right? Divine command theory, which argues that moral values are ultimately absolute values, that they are transcendent, that they are to be found beyond this human sphere, that we can only be fully human insofar as we have access to that transcendent realm of values. And that is why Christianity in its theology talks about the Holy Spirit and the need for the Holy Spirit to dwell within us, so that we can have access to that transcendent realm of values, right? So that moral problems, therefore, are problems that confront the educator in all areas, that are all inseparable from the whole question of the transmission of knowledge. We can't talk about teaching chemistry or teaching physics or teaching biology or teaching literature or teaching music in the absence of moral values, outside of the contextuality of moral values. And so it's very important that the teacher bears this in mind, recognizes how the values are transmitted. They may be transmitted verbally and overtly, but very often the best moral and most convincing and persuasive value transmission methodology is living it before the students. As you interact with the students, you teach them the values of commitment, of love, of compassion, of fairness, of honesty, and so on, justice, right? And so it is virtually impossible for us to find ourselves within the teaching learning situation and not be faced by this whole array, right, of cognitive, ethical, aesthetic values that we all have to employ simultaneously, right? It is virtually impossible for us to really, as Dr. Roberts was pointing out, fully compartmentalize anything, because entrenched in what we're doing, values and knowledge are closely intertwined. And that's where I'm going to stop this evening. I hope people haven't fallen asleep.
So folks, now is a good time to ask any particular questions, get anything clarified before we close down for tonight. So while you're thinking about it, we want to just do this in as 5 to 7 minutes, and then we can close shop. There was something that came to mind while you were talking about art, and of course, you know, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, as such.
Yes.
But I thought of you know, American architecture, which is related to American values. And so when you describe that the architecture tend to be very geometric, in terms of its arrangement. It's almost this idea of simplicity. And I think of the American value of efficiency and utility. And so to some extent, that may partially explain why their architecture tends to be, straightforward. No big set of hoopla.
That does explain it. In fact, pragmatism is the American philosophy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you're very correct there.
Still along the lines of art, what also came to mind was a TED Talk that I saw recently, one given by Sam Van Akens.
Okay.
And so he was this individual who came up with, and this is something that might be interesting to us as Seventh Adventists who believe in Revelation.
Yeah.
So he came up with this idea of a tree bearing 40 fruits.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody ever came across that. There's one tree that grows 40 different kinds of fruits. And most of the fruits are actually pitted fruits. But what happened is that he even as an artist, his father was into grafting and stuff like that. And, he really didn't want anything to do with it. But somehow or the other, he wanted to develop this tree because he was an artist. Right? He wanted this unusual tree. And so he put together his work. But during the process of doing so, he came to recognize that there were rare fruit trees around. Because of the mechanization of agriculture over time, you ended up with, whereas you may have thousands of different species of apple, you ended up with very few species of apple today. You could think about bananas in Trinidad, when we used to have a host of different varieties, quite a few varieties. Now we could only particularly talk about Lacatan.
Yeah.
I long for a Gros Michel, or Gros Michel as some people might call it. But in his thing, it was so interesting that his project from art added to science, as it were, combining with science, where he was now able to use his father's previous craft of grafting cuttings of these rare fruit trees now. And so that's how he ended up with his tree of 40 fruits. Now, this was so significant that he was eventually given Governor's Island in New York to actually use as a project to develop all of different trees with 40 fruits.
Okay.
Besides which, the Defense Department of the United States actually called them in on a project which was related to food security.
Okay.
So you think about Monsanto and big companies like those that where you ended up sort of narrowing the kinds of fruits that you can trees that you can plant. Seeds are an issue around concerning that. And so I'm just thinking about how art is sort of suffused with other other areas of knowledge, such as science. And it sort of gives me the sense that, there are ways in which we can be innovative, and we can lead our students to be innovative in that sense, and to think broadly about the kinds of things that they can do with their knowledge, even when sometimes the basic knowledge is usually low down on the totem pole.
Beautiful point. And it comes back to the original point you made when you problematized the whole issue of compartmentalizing knowledge, because I did this for reasons of elucidation and so on. But at the cutting edge of scientific practice or human creation, you can't make those separations again. In fact, one of the things that mathematicians talk about when they're discussing their mathematics is that one of the evidences of the correctness of the mathematics is its beauty or its elegance. Talk about elegant mathematics and beautiful mathematics. Once it fulfills the laws of symmetry, they are sure that it has to be correct. So that there's almost an aesthetics about mathematics.
Right.
And we talked about it. I didn't bring it into the discussion, but remember the linkage you made between mathematics and music.
And music. Mm-hmm.
Right? Music is rigidly and strictly mathematical. If your mathematics fails in the music, it's not harmonious any longer.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because the chords have a mathematical relation with each other. The rhythm has a mathematical movement that is consistent and ongoing. Right? And even though you may have dynamics in the music, it follows mathematical structures, the 4/4 and the 3/4 and the 2/4 and the 6/8 and so on. Right? So there are points at which mathematics, it's like logic. Right? Logic is the point at which language and mathematics meets. Next year I'm going to be dealing with language philosophers, because a lot of latest 20th century philosophy is linguistic.
Absolutely.
Right? But language and mathematics meets in logic. Right? Music, you can find that same beauty. John Keats had a famous statement, and scientists like to use it now in one of his poems. I studied it so long ago, I can't remember the name of the poem, but he says, beauty is truth beauty. Right? So that it's the meeting of cognitive and aesthetic values. And really and truly, they are inseparable. I mentioned earlier about the design for a motor car. If it's not aesthetically pleasing, no matter how effective and good it is, you don't want it.
So Nadia asked the question, though. I think it was Nadia, yes. To what extent should the church embrace art? So it's a broad question, but...
Yeah. Well, it's a lovely question. And the church has embraced that. I don't think the church is skeptical about it at all any longer. First of all, Christianity embraced it very early. In fact, when you look at the whole, in the early church, there was a serious split over the question of statues in the church. And the iconoclasts were saying, we don't want any statues in the church because the statues are idolatry. And those who were arguing for the statues said, no, we have to keep the statues because the statues are beautiful. They communicate the stories of the Bible to people who are illiterate and cannot read and write. Again, you see the meeting of the beautiful and the useful. Right? And there was that conflict in the church, and eventually the church was almost split over it until the iconoclasts had to give way to those who wanted to retain many of those statues. Now, the problem with the statues is not that they are bad in themselves, but that primitive people have a tendency to worship them as gods in themselves. Okay. Right? What has happened now is that I think we are an advanced civilization, and we recognize that we're not going to worship these things because our scientific knowledge gives us a better understanding of the nature of reality. We know what a painted picture is a painted picture. So that even though we accept the commandments as they are, we still make graven images. You might remember going to General Conference building in Washington. You were there too, Dr. Roberts. And it depends on which year. Yeah, there's that beautiful, there's that beautiful sculpture at the front of it. And then the paintings on the walls of the story of the early Christians and people falling off the dream that Ellen White had. Yes, and many of our books are graphically, designed, illustrated, so that we have been using art quite effectively. One of the problems, and again I'll go back to the colonial thing, is that the problem that we have, and we have to correct it. We can't expect people in the metropolitan country to correct it. All the angels still are white, right? And it is our artists, our Christian artists, that have to redefine angels now. We have to get black. We have to get black and brown angels, But art is a powerful instrument in communicating the truths of the message.
Hi, good evening. Sorry to just talk like that. I couldn't find my my icon.
That's all right.
My hand. Yes, thank you for answering the question. Is it Dr. Isaac?
Professor Isaac is fine.
Yes.
Okay. I was also asking in the context of music as well. And well, let me start with music. I remember as a young girl, there was quite a controversy over playing of the steel pan in the church.
Yeah.
I see that now it has been, it is embraced.
Yeah.
However, um, when we look at art, you know, the human body is a form of art as well.
Yeah.
And we recently had the
Okay.
controversy of the models in the church, right? Additionally, I was also looking in terms of music, where we have different genres, like we have
Mhm.
gospel soca, and we have all these different genres.
Gospel
And I
Lipso.
was wondering, in terms of the context of the church, as a Christian educator, um, or even being a member of a Christian institution, to what extent do the church embrace art? No, to me, to be honest, I think you did answer it at the end of the lecture when you did state that value and knowledge are intertwined. So
Yeah.
basically, that should be a guide. But I just wanted to bring that into light,
Right.
considering it is a recent controversy with the models and all that.
It's as old as religion itself and old as human civilization. Right? They've always had those problems. Um, every instrument had a problem getting into the church. Every instrument. The organ had a problem, Middle Ages, of getting into the church because it was seen as a pagan instrument, right? And the blowing instruments, the trumpets and so on, they have had problems getting into the church until the great composers of the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe began to write music, church music, using those instruments. The violin was a gypsy instrument, right? And church people didn't want it in their churches. The organ had already taken its place and nothing could replace the organ. The violin eventually got in, and pan, right? And that is how societies change. That is how cultures develop and grow, right? But music has always been a central part of Christian worship, a central part of almost all religious worship. There's a sense in which when we use the arts, we offer to God the best, the ideal creations that come from us. We create a song, right? We paint a picture, we produce a work of sculpture, and so on. We develop a play that can celebrate. Because really and truly, in fact, a lot of these things came out, a lot of these arts came out of religious ritual. If you look at the ancient Greek dramas came out of Greek ritual, religious ritual, right? The dances and so on. The problem that we have in the Caribbean with dancing is that almost all our movements are secular
Yes. Yeah.
movements. You just start to move and you move like anybody in the secular world, but there are religious forms of dance.
Mhm.
And in fact, it is church people that have to develop those religious forms of dance, you know. So art goes very closely with religious worship.
So here's something that comes to mind. So as oh my word, Nadia was mentioning a while ago about this particular issue as it's relevant to the church. So well, Mrs. Petronetta Pierre Robertson, right? She is the editor for the Caribbean Journal at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine.
Right.
And she has been writing novels. Two of the novels that she wrote, note what I said, novels, right? So think church and novels, right? One of the novels was named The Uncontrollable Flame. Think about what that looks like. The other one was No Guarantee, which was really a follow-up as such.
Yeah.
But the bottom line, those were romantic novels.
Yeah.
What she was endeavoring to address was the issue of sex and chastity.
Yeah.
And yet she had difficulty with the church really embracing that idea. Now, mind you, she has been able to go to different places and such like that.
Yeah.
She has even been given an award for her work as such in trying to address a topic that we prefer to kind of keep covered even up to this day and age. It's sometimes amazing.
Right. Well, I was kind of partly involved with her in that I attended all her book launches and spoke on one or two of them, and did indicate that what she has done is tremendous. It's of tremendous historical significance.
Mm-hmm.
For example, what she has done in her novels is that she has captured a slice of Trinidad or Caribbean Adventist life that we will lose completely, right? Because it cannot be captured by history books.
Mm-hmm.
One of the arguments of the artist is that he can go beyond the historian because he can bring to life the characters of history.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When you read A House of Mr. Biswas, I mean, A House of Mr. Biswas has educated me about East Indian society in Trinidad more than any treatise that has been written on it by social scientists. When you see the relationship between, Matulsi and her grandchildren and things like that, because it really puts in a real existential situation the dim, shadowy characters of history and sociology. It brings them to life, and even though it is fiction, in fact, the early novelists argue that it is fiction, but it is more true than the truths of history. And I think that her achievement is a tremendous one. I didn't know about any other local West Indian Adventist novelists, but I know that 60 or 70 years from now, if you want to understand how Adventist youth lived in Trinidad in that period that's gone, you're going to have to read Petronella, Petra Pierre, right?
So, I mean, I have some other questions, but I want to respect everybody's time. It's now 17 past 7. And so if there are no other questions, Professor Isaac, anything to add before we close down for this session?
Yeah.
All right.
What's that? Any final comments?
Yes.
Not really. I think I've said all that I needed to say. I just hope that the students are going to, follow up on the notes. I'm going to send another version of the notes for you, which is a little more coherent.
Right.
And I want you to do the reading. Remember that all of the efforts that we're making here in terms of the lecture and the notes is to direct you to the reading. Names are mentioned, systems, structures, trends, developments. You have to pursue that, right? In terms of your reading, encyclopedias and so on, in order to gather the relevant information. So that in the end, when you begin to talk about your own philosophy of education, you can draw on all of that body of knowledge and all of the learning that you've acquired during the course.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Isaac. And with that, I want to say thanks to students for your presence and for your participation. And I want to continue to encourage you to do the needful as we endeavor certainly to better ourselves and to better the circumstances of those placed within our charge. Well, good night to everyone.
Right, good night.